Hello and welcome to this video on generating digital forensic reports. This video comes about from the perspective that I struggled a lot with the generation of this report. I was unsure what topics to cover, the amount of content that I needed to generate, and in general it was just a difficult component for me. So I figured I would actually create this to try and save others from having the same degree of grief that I had. It took me a long time to work out what it was required, and once I did, I wish I'd had someone to show me a whole lot earlier. So this is my attempt to help you out. So you can see we're going to cover the various topics or the various sections of the report that are listed on your screen now. We'll cover the content that's required and some of the considerations that you need to have when you're creating content for your report. A couple of important things you need to give consideration to is, firstly, the audience for the report. As a digital investigator, you would typically come from a highly technical background. The report is targeted for a court of law, lawyers and magistrates. So it's important that when you create content and the language that you use, you don't delve too deeply into technical content. You're going to have people struggle to understand what you're saying. You're going to be clear, you're going to be concise, and the language that you use needs to be specific for your audience. The other thing that is really important and often overlooked is, as a digital investigator, it is not your role to assign guilt. That can only be determined by a court of law and a magistrate. If you find yourself writing so-and-so person is guilty of this offence because, then you're wrong. More than likely your report will be thrown out because you've written in an emotional manner and it can be claimed that you've got bias. Your report needs to be unemotional and just simply state the facts. Nothing more. Don't introduce your opinion. And certainly don't introduce your thoughts around whether this person is guilty or not. So the first section that we're going to cover is the cover page. It doesn't have to be glamorous. It just needs to be short, succinct, and highlight what the case is, case number, whatever. It just needs to be a simple cover page so that whoever picks up the report can identify what the report is pertaining to and what case it's relating to. Certainly you shouldn't get too hung up over that. It's just a simple title page. For the purposes of your assignment, you could simply just have your student ID and the assignment number, but in real life you would have additional detail around the specific case numbers, etc. The next thing that's really important is any notes or disclaimers that you should have listed in big bold font. This is because that your report may potentially have confronting or distressing content. In real life, you may be displaying pictures of lewd and cruel acts relating to child pornography. If someone's not prepared to see that, or they're not aware that your report contains that, and they open up and see the content that may be highly distressing, then you may be doing someone a significant amount of mental harm. So if your report does contain distressing or disturbing content, it's probably very important to call that out in big bold letters at the beginning of the report, so people reading the report can make an informed decision as to whether they want to keep reading that report or not. The other important disclaimer or note that you need to put on this page is the fact that there might be links contained within the report that, if clicked on, would take the user to offensive or illegal sites or content and the like. Calling this out is very important so users are aware that any links might be live and or still operational and prevent unnecessary or difficult discussions taking place later on. So with the cover page and disclaimers out of the way, we're now going to get into the crux of the report, and this is the actual detail of the report that you're going to start fleshing out. So the first section is the overview or the summary of the investigation, and you're going to identify various things like the evidence and the software and the like that you used. It doesn't have to be overly large, but as an example, you can see one that I did when I did my assignment. It identifies clearly the evidence that I was using, the name of the image, the checksum, the computer name that it came from, and so on. This information is readily available once you load the image into Autopsy. It's important to take a checksum at the beginning of the investigation and a checksum at the end of the investigation to validate and verify that no evidence contained on that image has been changed in any way. And that's really important to avoid situations in court where the defendant might be suggesting that he's been framed or evidence has been planted, etc. So you can call that out clearly, that because the checksums were the same at the beginning and the end, that nothing on that disk had been altered. So the other thing that you need to give consideration to is that when you're doing your investigation and generating this report is also a step-by-step or a how-to, and I think the word recipe has been used in the past as well. That's because at some point your report or the findings within your report may be challenged. Someone other than you may need to go back and rerun the steps that you undertook to prove or verify or find out why something went wrong. If you don't include the tools that you've used and the steps that you've undertaken, then the next person that comes along to verify your results or validate your results is going to have a tough time, if they have a chance at all. So part of the summary is to list all of the software and ideally the versions that you've used as part of the investigation. So should the need arise, they can go back and recreate your investigation right down to the versions of the software. In addition, as part of the summary, you can see that I've listed at a high level the overall totality of the content relating to the offence. And this is just a summary page for a magistrate to look at so they can get an understanding of the extremity of the offence. The next section is time comparison details. And this is important because you may not always get evidence that has been collected that is in the same time zone as you. It's important to get an understanding of and call out differences in time zones when examining evidence so that the people reading the report have an understanding that you've identified that evidence has come from a separate time zone and that you've taken that into consideration when doing your analysis. Having an understanding of this is also critical when you're trying to establish someone being at a certain time. This is also critical to establish and get an understanding of, because if you're trying to align someone being at the console when a specific event or when evidence occurred, then the analysis of the evidence in your time zone may not necessarily align with the date stamps or the time stamps of the evidence. When it appeared, there may be a skew. So this is important to understand and take into consideration. Again, this section doesn't need to be large. It just needs to be a sentence or two declaring the time zone and that you've taken it into consideration. So the next 5 headings, because of convention, are called issues, issue 1 through X. And here we show 5 specific issues, but you can have more. 5 is typically the minimum, as shown here on the slide, but if you find additional issues relating to potentially a different offence, then you can call them out. There's no limit to the number of issues that you can highlight or report upon. The order in which these issues occur too is not set in concrete, and you can change them around if you feel it flows better or it suits your needs. So the first topic is, or issue 1 in this list of issues, is content relating to the offence. And this is where you have to give consideration as to what is content, what is the specific offence, and how that content relates to the offence. For example, in real life terms, if the offence was, say, child pornography, then it serves no purpose if you're listing or reporting on content relating to roses. So you want to be specific about the content that you're reporting upon and how that relates to the offence. One important thing not to do is to just report on content in general in the hopes of padding out your report. That will do you a disservice, and in real life will actually get your report thrown out of court. To show you an example of what I did for this section, I'll show you my report that I generated. Now this section doesn't have to be a gazillion pages. You just need to list half a dozen specific artifacts that relate to the offence. For example, you may find thousands of images that are contraband, but no magistrate is going to want to sift through 700 or 800 pages of images that you've gone through and painstakingly listed as content relating to the offence. So what you would typically do is go through and list half a dozen or so images to demonstrate that the offence did in fact take place, and the rest you wouldn't necessarily show the images, but you'd just go through and list in detail, but the rest you wouldn't necessarily show as images, but you would highlight in a spreadsheet in listing format with all the relevant information. This will keep the size of your report down. If a magistrate wants to, they can then order the residual of the evidence to be printed out, but at least you've given the information as to where you've found this information so they can go hunting for this evidence if needs be. Certainly don't overcook this. It doesn't need to be hundreds of pages. It only needs to be a few at most. And certainly you need to maintain focus on what is content relating to the offence and how it relates to the offence. The next section in your report is identifying who the owner of the asset or the computer is. Give consideration as to why this is important. What do you hope to achieve by identifying someone? And more so, what is required to sufficiently identify someone. The fact remains that we need to establish who owns the content. By doing that, we can align someone to the offence. This isn't assigning guilt, that's an important differentiation, but we can certainly assign ownership and identity to the asset as a big difference. Again, this section doesn't need to be large. It just needs to have a few paragraphs supporting your statements and evidence. Again, as an example, I'm showing you mine that I did as part of my report. It's simply 3 or 4 paragraphs identifying who the owner was and why that's the case. Again, you don't need to overcook this section, just state the facts. So point 7, or intent, is to highlight that the suspect intentionally undertook illegal or offensive activities. So you have to give consideration and ponder what is an intentional act and what is not an intentional act. And this is something that as an analyst, you'll need to work through and try and uncover. For example, clicking a link on a web page is an intentional act. You physically have to move the mouse cursor and depress the mouse button. Content that might be downloaded via malware is not necessarily an intentional act. It may be, in some cases, where the user has downloaded the malware on purpose and executed it to download the content on purpose, but that's something that you'll need to work through and try and prove that something was done intentionally. Again, this section doesn't need to be excessively large. You just highlight components of evidence that clearly demonstrate that content was downloaded or an offence took place with intention. Again, as an example, you can see that mine at best goes for about a page, and I highlight specifics that indicate that the user intentionally clicked links, had bookmarks, and the like. This is something that you'll need to look through and validate in your own right. So the next section in the report is the quantity of files. And you've got to ask yourself, why is this important? Why would someone want to know the quantity of files relating to the offence? If you find one offensive or illegal artifact, is that the same as finding 1,000 of the illegal artifacts? So this section relates to the extremes or the order of magnitude of the crime. For example, a magistrate might think differently if one image was found versus 2,000 images. It clearly shows that someone had an ongoing determination to keep pulling those contraband files down. This is where you need to give an understanding of the overall totality of the offensive material. Again, this is something that I did in my report. This section doesn't need to be large. It just needs to summarise the amount of files relating to the offence in summary. The magistrate and the lawyers can see the overall order of magnitude of the offensive material that was obtained. And this would play a big determination in terms of repercussions the magistrate may allocate as part of the crime. Keep in mind as well that when talking about the quantity of files, this relates specifically to the content relating to the offence. This isn't just JPEGs or PNGs in total on the system. This has to be specifically relating to the crime. Section 9 relates to the installed software onto the system. Often most corporate systems will have what's called a standard operating environment or an SOE with the default minimum software required for a person to undertake their basic roles or basic duties. Quite often you'll find that users will install additional software depending upon what they need or what they decide that they want to install. So this issue relates to any specific software that may have been installed that pertains to the offence. For example, would Winamp or some other audio player be relevant in this instance relating to the report? This is an opportunity for you to call out the software that has been installed that may relate to the offence. As an example, this doesn't need to be big. As an example, this is my report and it highlights the software that I feel related to the crime in terms of replaying the crime, accessing the material and or encryption software to hide material. All of this also shows intent to do things such as distribute or hide evidence from other people. Again, this is important that you give consideration as to what relates to the crime and what doesn't. For example, Office 365 may not be relevant to the investigation, but something like TrueCrypt or 7-Zip may. So the next section on this slide talks about the running sheet, but I would typically keep that last. So in this instance, I'm going to talk about timeline of events. The timeline of events is the order in which things took place pertaining to the event. As an example, I can show you mine. It's a chronological list of events or activities that took place and potentially how they relate to each other. But you list the activities or events in order, and again, this specifically relates to the offence and potentially tying this to the user. Things like accessing remote drives, emails sent, links clicked. It's also important when you're developing the timeline how you actually tie that to the user, and you need to give consideration to such things that would result in the user being at their desk at that time when the offence took place. For example, when you're sitting at your desk yourself, what are the things that you're actually doing? For example, you may be sitting there looking at a video pertaining to this lecture or a university lecture. At the same token, in another window, you may have your email open and be receiving emails or sending emails as you're listening to a video. So you need to give thought to the actions or specific actions that tie a user to their desktop at the time of an offence. It's hard to prove that someone specific did or didn't click a link, but if the link was clicked at the same time or within close proximity as to when they sent an email in which they need to authenticate into the account and thereby providing their credentials, then that ties them to the desktop at the time of the offence. So you need to give thought as to what are the things that you would actually do at your desktop whilst you're working that would be considered reasonable things to do whilst you're sitting on a computer. And this is how you tie a user to specific events or offences. Again, it's not your place to assign guilt. You state fact, but you are allowed to highlight and call out activities that tie the user to activities of an offence. This section will probably go for a few pages, 3 or 4 pages, depending on how much information you find. There are tools out there that will automatically generate timelines, but in my experience, it's better to construct these manually as it gives you greater granularity and greater say over the order in which you present things. A lot of these tools that generate timelines automatically pull in events that wouldn't necessarily relate to the offence, and it just clutters the whole timeline overall. By doing it manually, you can keep your timeline succinct and keep the reader focused on core content. So the last section that I wanted to talk about in terms of generating content for your report is your running sheet. And this is by far the most important component of your report. This is your step-by-step list of things that you've done. Here you list every command that you've run, the software that you've run, the output. You even list errors and mistakes. This is so that if your report is ever challenged and they need to recreate the output from your investigation, then the next person, who may not be you, stands a fair chance of being able to follow your steps. This section covers the bulk of your report and will go for many pages. As an example, this is mine. You can see I highlight where I've downloaded the files for analysis. I confirm each of the checksums, and then I go into my investigation. And I even list errors and mistakes so that the next person coming along can follow exactly my steps and in theory produce exactly the same result. So this for me went for about 10 pages, and it's important that you're detailed in your commands. It's also important that you list all of the switches and function modifiers that you run whenever you run a command. The person coming behind you to validate your report and or findings will need to know exactly how you got the output that you did. And it's important that if ever there was a time you opted for greater detail than brevity, this is it. You need to be as detailed as possible. So this brings us to the conclusion of this video, and hopefully it gives you a better understanding of how to frame and put together your report and the sort of things that are required in terms of your content generation. It's important not to panic and go into analysis paralysis. Ultimately, you're just reporting on facts. And once again, I state, because I can't state it enough, you're not there to assign guilt. If at any point you've said that John Doe or Jane Doe or whoever is guilty, then you've done it wrong. And it's also very important as you're generating your content that you remain unemotional and speak in a very businesslike, emotionally separated point of view.